you know, it would only have happened in disadvantaged communities, but actually when people came to speak to us, it happened absolutely everywhere. So the scope needed to be very broad, and then there were discussions about whether there should be a cut-off date. But we already knew that some of the victims were in their 80s and some even in their early 90s, so we felt that there really shouldn't be a cut-off date either. So I know there was a lot of criticism of those terms of reference, but I think that without them, there'd have been whole sections of victims and survivors in institutions that hadn't been examined, and it would have left a lot of questions unanswered.
But it was incredibly broad. I mean, do you think that because it was so big, that there are areas that have just not had the examination they should?
No, I don't think that. Because what emerged reasonably quickly, and we carried out 15 investigation areas that were a combination of locations and thematic aspects of it. But what was very clear very quickly was that perpetrator behaviours in institutions were very similar regardless of the settings in which the abuse had occurred. In other words, you know, the grandest public school and the most lowly children's home, perpetrators behaved in very, very similar ways. And indeed, in the final report, we actually listed those sorts of behaviours and the negative behaviours of institutions in response to that, and on several other areas. So that was a big learning, actually, for going forward, that was the case. Just to add something to what John said, there were no time parameters, but the furthest back we went was to the beginning of the child migrant scheme in the 20s, and the reason for that was because the victims were ageing and many were deceased, although the government accepted our recommendation and took it further, and in fact made payments. We recommended that flat rate payments should be made to those who were surviving, and they actually allowed the nearest relative of the family to receive the compensation funding. So that was how we started. That was the very first one.
Belle Ribiera-Addy.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, witnesses. The first two chairs appointed were Baroness Butler-Sloss and Fiona Wolfe, and they withdrew after it was alleged they were linked to individuals and establishments under investigation. Do you think this disrupted the inquiry in any way?
So they were chairs of the non-statutory inquiry that was set up prior to it being turned statutory. Clearly it disrupted. It's difficult to describe at the time the feeling that victims and survivors had when that first non-statutory inquiry was announced and established. So clearly it caused massive disappointment, massive disruption when those two chairs had to stand down. Understandably it did, and it's what in the end led the cause for it to be statutory, because there was a growing belief that was the only way that people would be held properly to account. So you have to be totally honest and say that caused a massive disruption, and perhaps more than anything, it really started to erode the trust that those victims and survivors had in the whole inquiry process. And it meant that quite a lot of time had to be spent rebuilding that trust at the beginning of the statutory inquiry.
Thank you. And what was your opinion of the responses from the then government and other institutions into the final ICSA report?
From October the 20th, 2022?
Yeah.
That was when the final... Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah.
Okay. So that was the end of the process when we finally launched the final report. It wasn't the first time we published recommendations, of course, because we had done that in the course of the entire inquiry, which I would commend to others to do, rather than wait to the end to do everything. But so we had, I think, apart from the 26 of which we had repeated because we did not consider the initial response when they had been part of an investigation report, considered the response to the institutions concerned, including government, we didn't consider the responses to be adequate. So we repeated those, added others, and in addition to that, we had 87, I think, from the previous. No doubt if you're interested, we'll come on to that. But of course, the response initially from, there have been a lot of Home Secretaries in the course of this experience. At that time, the Home Secretary was Grant Shapps, and he made a very supportive statement in the House, and we were much encouraged by it. However, I think that was probably the high point of our experience with the last administration, because Mr. Shapps wasn't there within a couple of weeks. It was the next person, Ms. Braverman. Or yes, it was, wasn't it? The 7 or 8 that were there. But it was awful. I cannot tell you how it felt to constantly read the response when we got the final printed version of the government's response. It was inconsequential, insubstantial, committed to nothing. And the wording that was used very often amongst the 20 recommendations was, we accept the need for whatever it was, but made no specific commitment to delivering it or any timescale whatsoever at that stage. And the reaction of all of us, but mostly victims and survivors, was such huge disappointment and anger at what they had pinned a great deal of hope and anticipation on, that the recommendations we made would be delivered.
Thank you very much.
I can give you more detail on what that process of attempted engagement was like, but only if you're interested.
We're happy for you to do
Yeah.
so.
Are you sure? Yes. Okay. I did actually have a note of all of the various dates where we attempted engagement, and there were many, and ultimately it was, of course, with the Survivors Trust and others that we have tried to gain the support for implementation of the recommendations. But it's been nearly 2.5 years now from the time that we launched the final report. But there were a number of occasions where we heard from officials that they were attempting to take things forward, but unfortunately that it never had any outcome. We rarely had follow-up to some of the discussions, and there weren't that many because there were long periods of time where nothing happened, and there was no contact with me or indeed with the victims and survivor organisations about what should happen or our opinion on how to take things forward. Now, I proposed at one stage, I think it was in May or April or May 2023, that there should be a small grouping formed to follow up, to act as a monitor, if you like, on what was happening. And I wrote to the Chief of Staff in Number 10 and also to the Home Office about this idea. It didn't have to be expensive. We'd just meet regularly and check what was happening. I got no response. And I also it was suggested to me I should discuss it with the Home Secretary at the time, when it was prior to the final printed account of the government's response, and I did raise it with her, and she was very vague and nothing further was heard, and indeed, as I recall it, nothing further was heard at all by myself until the next Home Secretary came along, and that was later in the year when Mr. Cleverly was appointed, and I wrote to him saying perhaps we could reset this relationship and try to move things forward. And he was very amenable, and we did have a couple of meetings with him, and he attended an event in January of last year that we organised here to try to raise interest in this. I just wanted to mention one other aspect of all of this. In the end of May, after we'd seen the published response of government, myself and the 3 panel members from the original inquiry wrote to the Times newspaper saying how upset and distressed so many people were after all this time and all the energy, and the response felt disingenuous. It appeared to promise something, and in fact there was no substance to it. So that was our public statement of what we felt about what had happened. I was on holiday and I had a call from, or I had a message that somebody wanted to, from the Home Office wished to talk to me about how we could take the recommendations forward, and I thought that's great. Well, maybe this is a chance. This was in June. We'd sent the letter to the Times in May, and what then happened, which I thought was improper, was a special advisor came on demanding to know why I had written to the Times, and complained, and I was very clear that I was not accountable to this person as an independent chair for any actions at all. And I did have ideas about how we could take things forward if they were willing to listen. So that was not a happy experience either, of engaging and trying to push for these recommendations, which are much needed to go forward. Sorry, that was a long answer to your question, but I think it's important to say that we were not sitting back throughout this period of time. We were constantly trying to get political attention to the fact that these recommendations had not been acted upon. And of course, it's one of the biggest weaknesses of the public inquiry system. It's wonderful for establishing truth, etc. But the big weakness is there's no provision for structured monitoring of whether or not there is action taken, and verification of that action as part of the whole system afterwards.
Thank you very much. I think you actually helped answer my next 2 questions. That was brilliant. But I just wanted to be clear, that was the extent of your engagement with the Home Office following the publishing of the report.
Yes, I have a note of the different dates here that were relevant. I think I've probably covered them all. Yeah. I should say, of course, this has changed as well since the general election, and indeed in advance, apart from Mr. Cleverly attending the event in January, Jess Phillips also attended it, and they were supportive. But there was one recommendation that was going to be acted upon, which was a version of mandatory reporting, but it was a kind of inadequate version of mandatory reporting, which had some problems with it. However, it was the only one, and that fell with the Criminal Justice Bill when the election was called.
Jake Richards.
Thank you. The account of your communications with the Home Office over the period from October 20 is pretty shocking, actually. And I just wondered, I've got 2 questions sort of flowing from that. One's quite broad, and you may not feel that's appropriate to answer, but what was going on here? I mean, you've set out a number of recommendations. It was clearly a time of political chaos, a number of Home Secretaries which you've touched upon. But Suella Braverman came to what is now my constituency, met with survivors during that period as Home Secretary. I mean, was it that there was a lack of bandwidth in the Home Office, that they were concentrating on other things, or was it disagreement as to substantive policy, or what was going on? And then just secondly, of course, as you've pointed out, your inquiry in 2020 made a number of recommendations, as it did throughout, and they were, as I understand it, tell me if I'm wrong, but explicitly rejected by the government, 6 of those then. What communication did you have around those as well?
Well, I can only say in relation to the Home Office, and John may have something different to say, we were aware and made aware by officials that the interdepartmental aspects of any of the recommendations, and they were considerable, I think there were 5 or 6 departments that needed to be involved in decision making, if that's the right way to put it, but there was not a lot of support for the recommendations, and that part of that problem was disagreement, or in that bit of process where they're required to get sign-off. And the officials, I think, were very frustrated by that. But John, you may have something different.
That's right. I mean, to be fair to the Home Office, only 4 of their final report recommendations really related to them, so there would need to be broad cross-government agreement to the implementation of all 20, and that clearly wasn't happening. I mean, we only saw the tip of what was happening, but it was clear that it was not proving possible for the Home Office to get the agreement to other departments to launch a cohesive response to the report.
So just for a follow-up question. Is it your view then that actually, you said you wrote to Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister in 2023 that this has to be led by Downing Street, as it's so cross-departmental? And did you make any further attempts to engage with other officials in Downing Street, if not the Prime Ministers themselves?
No, I didn't. There's a point of contact because the person concerned had shown quite a lot of interest in the inquiry and had asked me to. I did indeed make quite a supportive comment about it when the announcement was made about mandatory reporting, but we didn't know the detail of it fully at that stage. But nevertheless, anything was better than nothing in some ways, because we had heard absolutely nothing about the other recommendation, except there was rejection of one I personally felt very strongly about was the cessation. There should be a cessation of pain compliance in custodial institutions where there were under 18-year-olds, and that was rejected outright.
Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Professor J. You've set out your engagement with the Home Office over the years, and I wonder, was there any time under any Home Secretary or any Home Office Minister where you were advised that the scope of your inquiry was either too broad for the recommendations to be implemented, or too narrow, specifically on grooming gangs? Did anyone ever intimate to you, either before or after publication, it was too broad?
No, not too narrow, of course. I think that, well, I already said it, but the width of it was a benefit for the reasons I've mentioned earlier. But I personally, because of the nature of being a chair, I did not engage directly with the political side of it. You have to be very... Fairness is really important as the chair of a public inquiry, and objectivity. But there was no communication of that time.
Did anyone ever say to you at any point during this that a second inquiry might be required?
No, absolutely not.
So there have been obviously a lot of calls for that recently. When did you first hear of a call for second inquiries into this issue?
Well, probably the same time as you did, but it was as a consequence of the general discussion in the public domain about, I don't particularly use the term grooming gangs and never have, not even when I was doing the work in Rotherham, but what we call organised networks, absolutely not. I've never heard of any of it.
Okay, so over 7 years and 7 Home Secretaries, the first call for a second inquiry was late last year?
Yes, that's
Okay,
that's
thank
right.
you.
Just place on record first that I was the leader of Telford Region Council, and the inquiry was going to come to Telford, didn't come to Telford, and we set up a local inquiry, which is now being seen by others as a good standard of a local inquiry. Also, I'm a former chair of the Local Government Association. Just taking you back to the recommendations and publishing the recommendations, I take your point, you did it in stages. Did you have any conversations with any other ministers, cabinet ministers or other ministers, around the implementation of those recommendations, taking on board that, as you say, not all of them relate to the Home Office?
No, it was, I think it was very clear legally that in the role I was in, it was not for me to negotiate such things with the political dimension in any way. It really was. Now, I cannot say that I wasn't familiar with some of their views, because obviously people in the inquiry, John and others, must engage. John was the secretary and the accounting officer, and you do have some engagement around what's your views about this or that, but not politically.
On the recommendations as well?
Well, I mean, you need to speak for yourself. I personally had no engagement, and that was considered to be the proper position for a chair to be in of a public inquiry.
Mr O'Brien, yourself?
No, so you certainly had no discussion about recommendations, because I think that's a line that shouldn't be crossed. The recommendations should flow from the evidence that the chair and the panel heard. After the final report was finalised within the inquiry, we obviously started talking to departments that there were recommendations that would go beyond Home Office borders, if I can put it like that. But it would have been entirely improper to tell people what those recommendations were. The whole point of publication was to make sure that they were in the public arena at the same time as they were.
So Professor J, for you to have a phone call from a special advisor within the government about your press and media comments, expressing frustration about the lack of action, can you say a little bit more about that conversation and what the purpose of the conversation was from your perspective?
Yes, and I first, as I say, I was on holiday at the time, and I got an email message saying this person wants to set up a meeting with you, and I contacted the secretary who was involved and said, what's the purpose of the meeting? And was told that it was to discuss the next steps in the recommendations and the implementation of the recommendations.
Was that the conversation that you had?
Well, it was a non-conversation, because the starting point was, why did you write to the Times?
And what was the tone of that conversation? Was it a genuine curiosity about why you'd gone public, or a desire to want to work together to implement the recommendation? What was your perspective?
I don't want to make too much of this, but it was definitely adversarial.
After the recommendation, so it wasn't a special advisor getting involved during the inquiry?
No, it was after the government's formal position had been published. And that's the point at which, as I referred to earlier, that I and my three colleagues who were panel members decided we'd write and say, you have let down so many people by this response and by the lack of specificity about what needs to be done. Indeed, there was hardly any.
And did that conversation lead to any effective change in terms of the government's approach around recommendations?
No. In fact, it led to quite a long silence. That conversation took place at the first 2 weeks, sometime in the first 2 weeks in June. And the next contact I personally had was, well, I made it. I wrote to Mr. Cleverly and said perhaps we could reset this. I was continuously thinking that somebody surely will get in touch to take some of this forward. It didn't happen. And I wrote to him and got a very quick response in late November, December of the same year. But in the intervening months, nobody from the inquiry had any contact. The inquiry, of course, didn't exist at that stage because it closed on the 31st of March. So, but nevertheless, there's plenty of scope for everyone would know how to be in touch.
Would you be able to provide the committee with a timetable, a written timetable of that contact, just for our use later on?
It's pretty well. Do you want me to? You will have recorded it, will you?
We don't need that.
No, I think it's fine. But just to be absolutely clear, so it would be inappropriate for ministers to have interfered while or special advisors while the inquiry was ongoing.
Yes.
So you wouldn't expect to have had any contact. But once you'd finished and the recommendation had been published, you feel that there was insufficient contact from ministers and responses until quite recently, and we'll come on to that.
Yes,
Yep.
I do think that. I don't think there's much scope for disagreement about
it's
it.
fine. I just wanted to be absolutely clear. Ben McGuire wanted to ask something.
Thanks for coming into the committee today. I just wanted to follow up on some of my colleagues' questions there. I just find it absolutely shocking that you don't seem to have had any engagement, not just with the Home Office, but other government departments when you've been set up as an independent inquiry to look at these and make recommendations. I'm just totally shocked by that, and I just wonder what your view is in terms of not only not having any engagement with the Home Office and other departments, not seemingly having any support to implement your recommendations. Why do you think that was? Is it cost pressures? Is it difficulties implementing them, practically speaking? What's your view on that?
I've never really fully understood it, because we were meticulous in the evidence gathering. We were very confident that the basis for the recommendations we made was solid. We were aware, of course, some, like redress, would inevitably involve one-off money, but quite a lot of one-off money, as you know from other inquiries. But what I didn't expect was a complete silence. And it wasn't just with us, as you know, the inquiry didn't exist anymore, but it was also with victims and survivors as well. I wouldn't say all of them, by the way, but some of the organisations we were in touch with, that nothing was happening.
Can I just add something to that? I think it's a fundamental fault with the inquiry process. We need to be clear, this story that you're hearing won't be unique to ICSA. There will be other inquiries, I'm sure, that will have had a similar experience to this. And it is because the minute the chair writes the letter to the relevant minister saying I've now completed, everything stops. So there is no apparatus in place for the inquiry to be influential. It's really interesting that in the individual investigation reports we published as we went along, which had recommendations in, we ran a process where after 3 months we would write to the relevant organisation, very often a government department, asking what was happening. We'd repeat that process at 6 months, and we'd repeat it at 9 months, and we'd published all those letters on our website. Over 80% of those interim recommendations were implemented, and I don't think those two things are disconnected.
Margaret Mullane.
John and Professor Joe both kind of focused in, following on from Ben's question, on the strategic positioning on safeguarding, where the focus shifts, which is a problem, and the leadership needs to be there to keep the safeguarding and child sexual abuse at top of the agenda, especially as what you'd said earlier with the victims. I just wonder, do you think that's possible?
In which context, I'm sorry?
Where kind of something happens and then there's the focus is gone. You both kind of highlighted that.
Yes, indeed. Well, for the same reasons as John's saying, it's the public inquiry system is very strong. Its purpose initially is to get to the truth of what happened. But it's not prosecutorial, no. You can name names, which we did in many reports of people who had failed, but it will not. It really is for police investigation in many instances to follow through, and in some instances, of course, that simply wasn't possible because it was too long in the past before they would do it. But in a general point, the leadership and the culture of organisations in relation to child sexual abuse is hugely important. And certainly I learned that lesson, well, I always knew it, of course, but I was 30 years in local government, but in Rotherham, when I wrote the report there, the political attitude to some of those issues was extremely important and negative.
Because you make reference then that it kind of switched to county lines at that point, both of you, didn't you?
Oh, you mean,
yes,
indeed. Sorry about to child criminal exploitation.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
The focus did change to that, and indeed at the beginning, way back in the 2000s, I know this obviously from the work in Rotherham because we looked what had happened in the past. It was child sexual exploitation was just seen as another, not necessarily grooming, a gang response to the street price of heroin and needing to find other business outlets for criminality. if you like. That was fairly shocking. But then, of course, you're quite right, later county lines came along. But we were aware in Rotherham, and I wrote about this in the report, that the specialist police were excellent, were very good, who knew something and were properly trained in CSE. But going back 10 years, the general impression was not of that police force, or wider perhaps. They did prioritise car crime and housebreaking, important as they are, but somehow or other they were always more important, it appeared, than the welfare of children and the appalling abuse that was going on there. And it might have been quite widespread at the time. But the specialist police were excellent.
Okay, thank you.
Professor G, what I think I'm hearing from you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is that not only was there a failure to implement, but actually the extent to which there was agreement to adopt the recommendations was all in rhetoric terms, and actually there was no real cross-government agreement on these recommendations. So in reality, the practice, the rhetoric and the reality were, there was quite a divide. Would you agree with that?
That was what we were led to believe by officials at the time.
So if officials told you that although government was publicly saying that they would adopt the recommendations, in reality there was some concern about the recommendations themselves?
Perhaps one example I could give you is mandatory reporting.
Yes.
The Department for Education were not keen on that.
Okay.
For example, but it's nothing necessarily to do with the intrinsic value of the recommendations. We understood it was a more pragmatic response that teachers wouldn't stand for it, or this was never told directly. That we were told of this at the time by officials. That's not the same as saying it's a bad thing. It's just saying, oh, it's too difficult to do, or it's we don't want to get into a row with trade unions over this, or etc. etc. There's a subtle difference there.
Understood. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Professor J and Mr. O'Brien. Two questions, one process, one detail. You paint a pretty shocking picture of inaction, almost active inaction. You submit your report, the initiative goes to the government, a few kind words, you try to express your disquiet quietly, nothing happens. You go to the press, you're slapped down. You both referenced this in passing, but how should the public inquiry process change so that we don't have governments just sitting on these things? How would you change the process?
Well, I think it's probably one of the biggest questions facing the public inquiries, and it's good that it is being aired, because it's, from my perspective, it's the biggest weakness is the lack of follow-up and monitoring built into the process. Not necessarily those in the public inquiry only. Then clearly not. It should be but there should be a more of a process and an independent process that should involve the key beneficiaries, or however you would like to describe them, of the recommendations of it as well. And there needs to be something more than what we have just now, because you can see nearly 2.5 years later, there will be action. I assume, of course, that will take place. It won't be some of these things that take a while to implement. But some could be done, and indeed in the conversation with the special advisor, I listed the areas that could be done without primary legislation. So in other words, it could be done quite quickly. And there were, I think, 4 or 5 that were possible to take forward. We knew that the Parliament at that time was running out of time for primary legislation, but do something, make a commitment. Should they have been re-elected, make a commitment that in the next Parliament these will be a priority. That was the kind of thing we were looking for. But in many ways it shouldn't have been for us to try to resolve that problem, it should have happened. But John, you have views on the public inquiry?
Yeah, I mean, just picking up on what Alexis said there, of course, in the year or two either side of us, there were other major inquiries reporting as well. So what you have is an environment when inquiries that were set up for all sorts of reasons, you never know at the beginning, of course, how long they're going to take. So you do sometimes get a concentration of inquiries or reporting at once. Many of the recommendations require primary legislation, and you'd require a clear parliamentary timetable for 4 years to get them all implemented, even if nothing else happened. So there needs to be some sort of monitoring process to make sure that there's oversight that can advise government on how you implement not just ICSAs, but what are the important ones that you need to implement to solve the biggest problems in all the areas of inquiries looked at. But I personally feel also that we need to get the balance right also between national statutory inquiries and non-statutory inquiries. I've seen really effective non-statutory inquiries, and very often you'll hear people say, well, they can't compel evidence, but sometimes we don't give it a try. You could actually have a non-statutory inquiry that goes along very successfully taking evidence, and indeed we've had examples of that. Hillsborough was an example of that. So I just think we need to get that balance right, because the minute you make it statutory, you introduce processes which increase cost and time automatically. And we need to focus on what is the problem we're trying to solve. Is it local or is it very specific? And would a non-statutory inquiry do the job before you consider the statutory process? Because the statutory process does include legal processes and all sorts of other requirements that just extend cost and time. But the biggest failure of the whole system is the failure to have an independent oversight, in my view, of the recommendations, because we will shortly be having other inquiries reporting, Post Office, for example, and you'll just have more and more recommendations requiring, in many cases, primary legislation going into a pot where the government agenda going forward already is taken up a large part of the parliamentary timetable. We need to have an honest conversation with people about that. We need somebody to honestly say, we're doing these ones first and this is why.
Thank you. That was very helpful. I'm sure we'll take that up as a committee. Now, my question of detail: before the whole issue hit the headlines again in December, what conversations, dialogue did you have with the new government in the period before that?
Well, as I said earlier on, Ms Phillips attended the event that we had and spoke at it in January of last year. And I think we had a discussion in September, was it? With herself and with colleagues who are behind me here, from the Survivors Trust, and a lawyer who was also part of the campaign was present. So we had a discussion at the beginning of September. Now, obviously, the new government had a lot to do, so we didn't. We weren't quite sure how things would proceed from there. But was that the last time that we had a?
It was the last time we had a formal meeting before the one last week. But
yes, we had one last week, of course.
But there were positive signs coming out. That there was a
yeah.
commitment to try and get things done.
Mm-hmm.
So with the new government, you went to them and said, reminded them of the report, or did they come to you, or how did it happen?
Well, I think we probably approached them because we thought, well, here's another option. You know, let's see if we can follow.
Of the current situation. So
Okay.
I just want to bring Jake Richards in.
Just moving back a bit to what Paul called the active inaction, I think, which is a good phrase, from 2022 October onwards. I just wondered, both of you worked on this for 7 years, gave up a huge amount of your time, and perhaps even more importantly, survivors gave evidence. How does it make you feel, and if you've had conversations with them, how does it make them feel when you compare that period of inactivity and a lack of engagement with what we've had over the last 2, 3, 4 weeks, where some of the same politicians, the Chief of Staff, who I think is now in the House of Lords, who didn't respond to you, are calling for another inquiry, is calling for the government to take immediate action after a period of essentially 18 months of inaction. I just wondered if you could share with us how that makes you feel professionally, and perhaps some of the survivors who I know you'll know very well, how it makes them feel.
The overriding concern is just get it done, to be honest, at this point. And why I had a huge number of requests for media interviews, etc. And I really felt very concerned at the weaponisation, if you like, of child sexual abuse that has gone on. And I declined to make, and I won't make any comment about the various actors involved in that. I wouldn't give them the oxygen of publicity. But just please, it was such a relief, by whatever means, we wouldn't have chosen it necessarily to have come about in this way, but we just need to get on with it. And we are assured of a timetable by the end of February. But it was relief more than, whoops of joy.
Yeah.
When you were last before the committee, you said the three most important recommendations were mandatory reporting, a redress scheme and a child protection authority.
Yes.
Do you still think those are the three most important recommendations?
I've heard nothing to say that or heard no evidence that would suggest otherwise. I mean, the rest are very important as well. And I would continue to have those three as the most important ones. But I have no illusions that they wouldn't, each of them take quite a bit of time. They're not going to be easily addressed, although for example, in redress, we had an enormous amount, and we had a thematic investigation in the inquiry into accountability and reparations, and amassed an enormous amount of material internationally and elsewhere, more locally, if you like, from Northern Ireland, from Scotland, but also from Australia and Canada and anywhere else was relevant to redress. So a lot of the work was done to set up such a scheme. There will almost certainly be funding, but that should be implemented, and it doesn't require a great deal more investigation or research in order to do it, in my opinion. But there are obviously, we were concerned, mandatory reporting is hugely important for the reasons that I think everyone will know, that this, more than anything else, this was the response we got from victims and survivors when we asked them, and many of them, of course, a very significant number, over 7,000, but by far the majority have asked what would have made a difference to your experience, and it's if there had been a trusted adult that they could approach, knowing with confidence that they would do something about it. But what happened in so many cases that we heard about was they plucked up the courage to talk to somebody, and it didn't stop. The abuse didn't stop, and they believed that this adult was going to do something, and they did nothing. And that must have been devastating for children.
The Home Secretary, in her statement last week, said they're going forward with three recommendations, one of which was mandatory reporting. The other two were making grooming an aggravating factor, and data collection, the way data is collected. Do you agree with those as being other priorities that should be taken forward, or were there better ones?
Well, I think those were the ones the Home Office could take. Well, no, actually, that's not the aggravating factor, but certainly the data set. I know it always sounds nerdy, but it's so hugely important. And in respect of the subject that's been most under discussion, child sexual exploitation, we know that's not going to be able to be done very quickly, because police forces all have different styles of classification, if indeed they monitor anything that's relevant, but the descriptors they use are not the same across all of the police forces. So to get an accurate picture of the problem of child sexual exploitation, the baseline across the board needs to be consistent, and it isn't just now. And that it's hugely important that that's fixed if we are to gain an accurate picture of where there are very serious problems that need to be addressed. So we did recommend, of course, a core data set, and that I absolutely believe that in the importance of that.
Making grooming an aggravating factor wasn't in your final report, it was in one of the subsidiary reports.
That's the same one, that's correct.
Yeah.
That's right.
Why didn't it make it into the final list of 20 recommendations?
Because it was very specific to the to child sexual exploitation. We had a set of the final report was never intended to be a collation of the most important from the rest. The only reason we included 6 others that had already been in other investigation reports was because the responses of those who should have been doing it were inadequate. And I'll give you a perfect example of that. Is there's no regulation. I find this impossible to believe, really, but it's true. There's no regulation of children's home staff in England, whereas Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland have had such a system of regulation in place. I first became a regulated person in 2002. Now, in England, the only regulated people in the social care field are social workers. Indeed, some government or other at some point actually stopped the regulation of social workers in training, which is bizarre. I don't know why they did that. But however, in the other 3 countries, there's significant regulation of others, and the priority is nearly always residential children's homes. And of course, we found that they were although it's a decreasing marketplace, if you like, because of the extensive use of foster care and other types of care. But nevertheless, we consider it to be very important that they should be regulated. And that's we could never understand why that had not happened, because it was 2012 when it was due to be introduced, and it didn't happen.
You see marked differences between England and the other nations?
In this respect, yes.
And in the actual practical outcomes that are different because of it?
Oh, I see. I don't know if because it's quite difficult to know, as I've just been saying, about how you count outcomes in these cases. However, you have to do some things because they're the right thing to do. And I consider strongly that this is the right thing to do, is that people who are looking after the most vulnerable in our populations should be properly regulated. And I cannot understand why it's never been done. Although and it's only one category at the moment in children's social care, which is the social workers who are regulated. The settings are regulated, but that's an entirely different matter.
And just on mandatory reporting, with Rotherham in particular, what difference would it have made, do you think, if there'd been mandatory reporting at the time?
I'm fairly confident there were so many people that told me that they had tried to tell people, and indeed many of them did tell their senior people. There was a grouping of children, just coming onto it, children's home staff who used to meet regularly and say, how can we deal with this? And we've got all these phone numbers of cars that turn up late at night to pick up, usually girls, but not only girls, from children's homes, and they can't lock them in. They can't, that's not how a children's home should operate. But they had no outlet, and nobody was interested in hearing. And certainly there was also evidence of some researchers and others who actually wrote to the Home Office and drew their attention to it. You may not remember all of this, but there was an inquiry into it. And the person concerned was treated very badly when this emerged, and basically disciplined or attempted to discipline her for having taken actions that she had taken in writing to the divisional commander of police and indeed to the social work, children's social care director about this. That she was punished for it. So there were people who did try, but I have absolutely no doubt that mandatory reporting would have made a difference faster in these circumstances.
I mean, I say this because I was the Minister for Safeguarding from 15 to 16, and I remember meeting the victims. I went to Rotherham, I met the victims, and I sat down with them, and the frustration was we told people and nobody listened to us, and that you know, so it really had resonated with me, and my fear is just that a mandatory report, unless it's acted upon, you've ticked the box, you've done what you needed to do. Certainly I heard that from survivors constantly. It can't just be a report, it has to be something that's actually acted on.
Yes, I think that we, insofar as we started to develop the model, definitely thought there ought to be a designated person who would receive in the police or children's social care or whatever, or people. It wasn't just your own boss.
Exactly.
There needed to be somebody where you a degree of protection would be afforded to those who were in effect whistleblowers and complying with the law. But John knows a bit more on this.
So I think mandatory reporting is also important for a different reason. I can't count the number of times in the inquiry that when an institution finally accepted it had sexual abuse of children happening, it immediately closed itself down. And I don't mean literally, I mean there was an enormous pressure from those at the top for everything to be internalised, and that led to a significant number of cases that weren't reported to the police at all, weren't reported to social services at all. Perpetrators were simply moved to a different area of the company or whatever it was. So I think mandatory reporting will make a real difference, because it needs to have two stages to it. You need to make sure that people are able to report, and your point, Chair, that the person they report to takes action, but it also needs to make sure there's a disincentive for those at the top of organisations to try and persuade people not to report. And no action can be taken by anybody until that report has been made. And that was such a common problem that in many areas we looked at, the organisations that would have dealt with that report were excellent, but the reports simply weren't getting through to them. So I think it will have a really big impact once the reports actually start being made. I agree, absolutely, there needs to be a structure beyond that, but the first thing we need to do is make sure the right information gets to the right people so the right action can be taken. And the important thing in many of the cases is that on the data is that it isn't very often what would be recorded was abuse, not sexual abuse on the database. The consequence of that is all the doorways to the right services for that child who'd been sexually abused were not opened properly because it was recorded as abuse. So we need to get data recording really accurate. You need to accurately record what it is that's happened so that all the genuinely excellent services that exist in many areas kick into place. So those two things combined, I think, will make quite a significant difference.
Just one thing to add to that is, although we've talked a lot about police and children's social care, there are much bigger settings, if you like, than some of those, where mandatory reporting would make a big difference for the reasons John's saying, and these include religious organisations and other more closed settings where they are not required to adhere to the standards of secular bodies.
I've got Chris Murray and Jenny Reid, and then we're going to move on from what's happened in the past to where we are today. So, Chris.
Thank you, Chair. In your previous answer, you spoke about how some survivors had gone forward to authorities to make reports and then nothing had happened. Mm-hmm. And I think, we're talking a lot about processes and politics and administrative structures here, but at the heart of this is victims who were the victims of terrible crimes. And delay has costs, not just in terms of what we want to do as a government, but for those people, can you talk a bit about what it was like for survivors of child sexual exploitation, child sexual abuse, to give evidence to your committee, what the difficulties that they faced were and how you overcame those, and what impact the lack of progress has had on them?
Oh, well, there are at least one person behind me could better answer that question for you, because you need to talk to victims and survivors themselves who, as you rightly say, are at the heart of it. I mean, we intended to put them, as indeed Theresa May, as the instigator of this public inquiry, intended that the victims must be at the heart of it, and I hope that we delivered that in various ways, lots of different ways. So there wasn't just one way of doing anything, but perhaps the most significant was something called the Truth Project, where individuals who had been the victims of abuse were invited to come forward confidentially and could have a session with a trained facilitator, usually somebody who was psychologist, social workers, ex-police or whoever, but who had a background and who had additional training for this purpose. And we consider that to be an innovation that was successful and meant a great deal, and we had the most extraordinary range of people who came forward to tell us about their experiences. It was quite shocking, and we published anonymous accounts with the agreement of the individuals every 6 months or so in various volumes from the inquiry, and they are extraordinary. So they're probably the best evidence you could, that's not evidence, but certainly material that I've seen, better than all sorts of research projects as well, but it's in, a lot of it is in their own words. So the Truth Project was hugely significant. I'll only mention a couple of things, but the oldest person that came forward was 84, was it, John?
87.
87. Never spoken to anyone out with his, I think it was his wife and immediate family, but had never actually gone out of his house on his own. Is that correct? Yeah. Since it happened.
So I trained to do Truth Project sessions, and this is a really powerful story, but I think it's worth telling. Really careful account. So this was a gentleman in his 80s whose abuse had happened between the ages of 6 and 12 by his local priest. Unusually, his parents had taken his report to them very seriously, reported to the police at the time, but this was in the early 1950s. Nothing happened. The priest was believed. But he came along, and the important point about truth sessions is, for many victims, they do not want to give evidence formally. They don't want to go through that process. So the truth session was a way for them to come and talk to us in a completely informal environment. So he didn't want to give evidence formally. He came to speak to us. And he took great care to tell me quite carefully during the session that he told his parents at the time, he had told his future wife, who he'd married quite young, as soon as they'd got married, that he'd been abused, and he told each of his 3 children when they reached 18 that he'd been abused. And it wasn't until he wrote to me 2 weeks after the session that the relevance of that became obvious to me, because he said, I'd never left the house from the age of 12. I'd either been accompanied by my parents, my wife, or my children. I thought you might like to know that after your session I felt able to leave the house for the first time on my own in 70 odd years. So the impact of people being able to come and share their experience in that way can be quite dramatic. And Alexis alluded to, this was the first time he'd shared it with anybody outside of his family. That was quite common in the Truth Project. So, but you asked how, a little bit about the process. You have to create the right environment. So be careful, the rooms and how we decorated them. You have to create an environment where people feel comfortable to come and talk to you about really quite personal things. But if you do it, it can be a very powerful way to engage with people who don't want to give evidence. Giving evidence at a formal inquiry is a big task to ask anybody to undertake. For a survivor, it can be really quite daunting.
Thank you.
Just one or two other points that came up from all of that, that many people have a perception of child sexual abuse as being like a one-off event. We discovered that from the Truth Project, the average length of time was 4 years, not one night. 4 years was the average length that they reported to us that the abuse went on for. And the average length of time it took from the individual to tell anybody about it, to disclose it, as we usually say, is 26 years.
Thank you very much. That's very powerful. Could I ask about when survivors, one can understand a survivor may feel quite conflicted or ambivalent about engaging with the process, and as you say, you've set out a range of different methodologies for them to engage. If a survivor changes their mind about whether or not they've given you evidence or granted anonymity, what do you think the correct response of an inquiry is in responding to that?
Well, of course they should agree to it if they change their minds. I don't know if there are legal reasons. I'm well aware that there's some discussion in Scotland at the moment on this issue. But it's not one that we confronted, except for people change their minds. Change their minds, that's fine.
I mean, you asked what you thought the correct process should be rather than perhaps what we did.
Right.
I think if a survivor gives evidence and changes their mind, it usually won't be they change their mind about the evidence, it'll be they change their mind about their name being associated with the evidence. And I think in those circumstances, I think the church should exercise their discretion to grant that anonymity, if you want my opinion.
Okay, thanks very much. And then my final question is, obviously the recommendations that you set out in your inquiry were firstly to help victims of historic child sexual abuse, but also to strengthen our resilience against it happening currently. And obviously it's happening across the UK in every community just now. What is your view of the impact of the delay in implementing your recommendations on current victims of child sexual abuse?
Well, although much of what we did was non-recent, we also, in nearly every case where we were looking, say, at a boarding school or a religious organisation, we checked what was currently the case and what was the current practice. And obviously we would bear in mind how many reports of sexual abuse of children had taken place, not just in the 70s or 80s, but in the last few years as well. So we went out of our way to make sure that it was up to date in that respect. But there has been a significant effect on people. I can't, of course, attribution is a problem, but nevertheless, the delays that have occurred, at least for those who are victims or survivors of abuse, and possibly for young people in the system right now, but certainly for the adult survivors, has been devastating. A lot of anger and some despair and some distress.
Your inquiry collected a significant amount of data from Scotland and Northern Ireland, if I'm correct, and of course you're an academic, you're based in Scotland. To what extent, and I suppose this is speculation, but if I may, the systemic and institutional issues that you identify in the report that leads to the child sexual abuse, do you have any reason to believe that the situation is any better or worse in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and to what extent do you think your recommendations are applicable across the UK? You'll know that there's an ongoing inquiry in Scotland.
Of course, yes, and I know about Northern Ireland as well, but I have absolutely no doubt that people behave in similar ways, both institutionally and both as individual abusers in whatever country. There could be an argument that because of the children's hearing system in Scotland that it may have been picked up earlier, but I haven't seen any evidence to confirm that that's the case, and it's possible, but I don't think there's any difference at all. There's a difference in context, and some things are, and some settings are more prominent than others in different countries, but it's my strong view, and I've expressed it in one or two sessions in the Scottish Parliament, that they must take seriously the recommendations. There's a lot of support for that as well. But in particular, issues like mandatory reporting have to be seriously considered. And in terms of the implementation, there should be no complacency in any of the other countries about these matters.
Okay. And on mandatory reporting, I believe the First Minister said last week that it would be considered. Do you envisage any situation where mandatory reporting could justifiably not be adopted? That makes sense.
Well, there's obviously, I don't support this, and that's why we made a statement in what we wrote about mandatory reporting, that there should be no exceptions. But of course, for example, the Catholic Church would say that the seal of the confessional should be an exception. There are other areas, possibly children's confidential helplines, which may have to be considered seriously as well. But I would say that we were very clear that there should be a minimum number of exceptions. But I certainly don't think that the seal of the confessional should be one of them.
Thank you. We're going to move on now to the current day. So thank you for filling us in on the past. I'm going to start with Sean Davis.
Thanks, Sharon. Just with your permission, just on mandatory reporting before I move on to the recent events, so very quickly, I think you said earlier on in your session that the recommendation that the previous government was bringing forward that then fell as a result of the general election, that version of mandatory reporting, I think I remembered you saying that that wasn't necessarily the view that you think it ought to have been. Can you just expand very quickly on that?
It concerns, well, this is quite complicated, the issue. John, you probably know this better than I do, but it concerns the protections that are not necessarily afforded to children of 13 and over.
So we recognised in the recommendation for mandatory reporting made in the inquiry that there are consensual relationships between children under 18, but maybe particularly in that 16 to 18 age range. So you have to be careful that you're not making a mandatory report of what everybody accepts is a consensual relationship, because it can lead to all sorts of consequences. Children don't then gain access to all the help they need to have a proper consensual relationship. But to answer your question, I mean, I described it as Swiss cheese. There were so many exceptions that allowed the exercise of discretion by whoever the person who was responsible for making the report should be. It was effectively worthless, if they considered that. So you could have a situation where you had a 13-year-old and a 17-year-old, and if they both said they were in a consensual relationship, it negated the need to make a report.
Thank you. So just to summarise, the version that was being brought forward before the general election, in your opinion, wasn't mandatory enough. There were so many exceptions, it didn't make it mandatory.
Yeah, there were other exceptions, but the biggest exception was around 13 to 18-year-olds.
That's really helpful, thank you. So just turning to recent developments. So July general election, a new Home Secretary. Can you just explain to the committee the contact that you had with the new Home Secretary and Home Office ministers, specifically from July to December of last year?
I've referred to the meeting with Ms Phillips as a Safeguarding Minister, which took place in September. And was there another one?
There was a meeting last week.
I'll come on to the meeting last week, if that's possible, in January. But in terms of July to December, one meeting with Minister Phillips.
And the event in Parliament here that was before.
That was January.
That was before the general election. Yeah. And in terms of that meeting, did it follow the same sort of settings as the previous attempts that you'd had with the various different Home Secretaries before the general election, in terms of wanting to understand the process of taking your recommendations forward? There
was general discussion, I would say, about it. And of course there were whilst we were there were 3 other people as well. And it was more general than specific.
Okay. And were you given any assurances that work was underway in regards to the report in that sort of the general meeting that you had with Minister Phillips?
Yes, we heard about, again, not specifically about what particular areas of work were underway, but what was referred to was the issue we talked about earlier, which was the discussions with other departments. And as far as we could see, obviously, the Home Office was attempting to coordinate that. I think that's reasonable to say, but that was at quite an early stage.
And did you have meetings from July onwards to December with